Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Introduction to Proclamation 2020 webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Sarah Ramirez. I serve as the Review and Adoption Coordinator in the Instruction Materials Division here at TEA. So let's jump right in and review our webinar agenda. So first, we have Kelly Calloway, our Senior Director of Instruction Materials. She will be reviewing the specific process of how instruction materials get reviewed and adopted here in the state of Texas. Next, we have Shelly Ramos, our Senior Director of Curriculum Standards and Student Support. She'll be discussing the essential knowledge and skills and the English language proficiency standards. Kelly will then provide an overview of Proclamation 2020. Amy Williams, our Director of Review and Adoption, will be talking about the specific deadlines and components within Proclamation 2020. Debbie Gonzalez, our Accessibility Coordinator, will be reviewing the accessibility requirements within Proclamation 2020. Amy will then discuss next steps, and Kelly will close out our webinar with questions and answers. We will be monitoring questions we receive during the webinar through the GoToWebinar application. We will try our best to answer all of them. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the publisher portal along with all of our slides and a complete audience question and answer document. Before we get started, we want to get to know our audience, so we have a few audience participation questions. Our first poll question: did you participate in either Proclamation 2010 or Proclamation 2011? Proclamation 2010 was issued by the State Board of Education in November of 2007, and Proclamation 2011 was issued by the State Board of Education in May of 2008. And we will close that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, great. So our next poll question: have you participated since the establishment of the Technology and Instruction Materials Allotment by the Texas Legislature in 2011? And we will close that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Our last question: which of the following proclamations, recent proclamations, have you submitted materials? You can select as many as you need to. We have several proclamations listed. And we will close that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for participating. I do want to remind you that you can submit questions through the GoToWebinar application. We are monitoring them and we'll do our best to answer all of them. We will move right along in our agenda and pass things off to Kelly.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. As Sarah said, based on the results of the polls, it looks like we've got a nice mix of people who are experienced in participating in Texas review and adoption processes and people who have never done so before, or at least who haven't done so in recent years. So this first part of this presentation of this webinar will kind of be primarily intended for those people who need to understand the big picture, who don't already have a deep understanding of the big picture of how instructional materials in Texas work. It's somewhat unique to the way that instructional materials work in many other states. So we're going to talk about funding. We're going to talk about both how they're funded and how those funds are spent. We'll spend a few minutes on why state adoption in Texas is important. Why should it matter to you that you have your products adopted? And what does that adoption process involve? First of all, how are instructional materials funded in Texas? They start with a giant fund. Pretend the circle is like bigger than the room you're sitting in. The permanent school fund, then the available school fund, then the instructional materials fund, and finally the instructional materials allotment. So there's 4 pots of money. The bubbles that you see here for available instructional materials and allotment are pretty much in proportion one to another. That's about the size of those pots of money as compared to the other pots of money. This one, though, like I said, is not nearly big enough. The Permanent School Fund was established in the Texas Constitution by Article 7. It is, in fact, the largest educational fund in the world. And it is just what its name implies, intended to be permanent. So forevermore, unless there's a zombie apocalypse, we will have funding in the Permanent School Fund to pay for education in Texas. The Available School Fund then is created from a payout of the Permanent School Fund. The payout is at a rate determined by the State Board of Education. They determine that rate each biennium, or for each biennium. They discuss it at about 3 meetings before they finally decide on an actual rate. They decide on that rate based on several factors. The current value of the Permanent School Fund, which the last 2 times they've established a rate has been very, very healthy. The upcoming instructional materials needs. For example, upcoming, we have pretty big and important needs in the area of English language arts and reading. And of course, the maintenance of intergenerational equity to make sure that we don't spend so much on our current students' instructional materials that we don't have money down the road for our future students' instructional materials. The rate for this biennium that we're in right now is 3.7%. That 3.7% then leads us to the establishment of the Available School Fund. So the Available School Fund is established each and every biennium. Generally speaking, we expect about half of that Available School Fund to become the Instructional Materials Fund. That's been traditional. However, the 85th Texas Legislature chose to appropriate less for instructional materials and more in their contribution to the Foundation School Program. So I think these are roughly proportional. It was about 40-60 this time. So that led us to the Instructional Materials Fund amount for this biennium of 2018-2019. This is kind of a busy slide, so let me talk you through it. That initial amount as appropriated in the rider is showing up at the top, so something over $1 billion. And then there are several areas in which we take money out. We set aside money for other needs. The blue numbers, the 1 million for freight and the 3-something for IM direct and 612 for IM indirect, those are agency costs. What does it cost the agency to make sure that these instructional materials are provided appropriately to districts? Then the kind of goldish numbers, those are special projects that are identified in the actual rider or in an actual rider. $2,500,000 for college readiness in this biennium, $20 million for open source instructional materials in this biennium, $10 million to create an instructional materials portal in this biennium, and $10 million for technology lending grants. Technology lending grants provide funds to districts so that they can provide appropriate access to technology and instructional materials to their students who may not already have that access. That leads us to the actual appropriation that we have remaining for the instructional materials allotments that go to districts. We set aside some additional funds from that, but these funds that you see set aside here in the dark blue actually are only set aside temporarily, and then they go back into instructional materials allotments. So they're not removed from the total amount that's provided to districts. They're just set aside for the purposes basically of math. We set aside $20 million for high enrollment growth, an amount for the JJAEP instructional materials, the Wyndham School District instructional materials, an amount per bilingual student, so that districts that serve bilingual students will have a little bit of a bonus added to their allotment. The amount that's left is simply divided by the number of students that we show in our current enrollment. That amount then led to this for the for this biennium, for the 18-19 biennium, $186.32 per student, an additional $19.19 per bilingual student. So if Johnny is a bilingual student, the district will get $200, or has gotten $205.51 to serve him through the provision of instructional materials. Allotment funds, once they're given to the district, that is done through EMAT. EMAT is our online ordering system, and we're going to talk about EMAT a little bit more in a few minutes. But those funds are provided through EMAT so that districts can use them in one of two ways. They can either submit requisitions for adopted instructional materials, or they submit disbursements for other instructional materials and instructional materials needs that aren't actually adopted by the State Board of Education but are still allowable expenses. We'll talk about the allowable expenses. Specifically allowed are instructional materials of any kind, technological equipment that leads to student learning, training staff in the use of either that equipment or the instructional materials that have been purchased, providing access to technological equipment for instructional use, in other words, providing computers through which the instructional materials can be accessed. Also, some salary and expenses for employees who make that possible within a district, and activities connected to reviewing instructional materials for TEKS coverage. Some specifically prohibited expenses include services for installation of technology, the physical conduit that transmits data, wiring, cabling, electricity, office and school supplies, travel expenses, items that are not directly related to student instruction, such as furniture, desk, those kinds of things, and equipment used at a warehouse or technology used at a warehouse for the purpose of storing or taking inventory of instructional materials. We'll talk a little bit about how districts are spending those instructional materials allotments so far in this biennium. They're spending most of their allotment money on instructional materials. As you can see here, 90% of the money that's been spent so far since September 1, 2018 is on instructional materials. Most of that is through disbursements rather than through requisitions, because there are more things you can purchase through disbursements than you can purchase through requisitions. About 10% of what they've spent so far has been on technology, 8% of that, 8% on equipment, and 2% on services. This slide and the next slide, I warn you, are 1 month old, and so these numbers are just a little bit out of date, but not very much. Frankly, I couldn't see updating them for the tiny little bit of change that we might see since February 1st to March 1st. We're now 5 months into the biennium. That's about 21% of the way. So one would hope that districts have only spent about 21% of their instructional materials allotment so that they can ensure that that allotment lasts them for the entire biennium. And in fact, they've done pretty well. They've spent about 30% of their of their allotment, but that's okay because we had a small adoption for 2018, and so it looks like districts are doing a good job with maintaining their instructional materials allotment and ensuring that they have funds left at the end of the day rather than spending them all in the first year of the biennium. So if districts can spend all of this on things that are not actually adopted by the state board, why is it that we have this state board adoption process? Why is state board adoption important? The purpose of the state board adopted products is to make sure that districts know exactly what they have access to and that they have an opportunity to choose instructional materials with complete confidence in the extent to which those materials provide instruction in the required TEKS, in their availability in accessible formats for students with print disabilities, and that comes at no cost to districts, their availability at an established cost for at least 8 years, and that they can be easily and conveniently ordered through EMAT. So in other words, it is highly beneficial to districts to use adopted instructional materials because then there's no questions down the road. There's no question about TEKS coverage. There's no question about whether they can get those materials in Braille or large print for their students with disabilities. There's no questions about whether those materials are going to get more expensive next year than they were this year. And there's no question about how they can be easily ordered. Why would you want to have your products adopted? For all those same reasons. When you have a product adopted, then you're ensuring districts have those benefits that we talked about on the previous slide. Another reason you will want to participate in the adoption process, or you might want to participate, is that some districts have local policies that prevent them from using non-adopted material unless there are no adopted materials available. Through going through the process, you get an independent third-party review of your product. The products are made available to the public, and believe me, the public participates in that review. We have a very active and interested public in Texas, constantly providing input and feedback on instructional materials, and many publishers find that input very helpful. You also get to offer your product for sale in EMAT, and that means it's easier for districts to purchase and easier for you to work with those districts. And finally, who doesn't want to be adopted in the state of Texas? Adoption in Texas is still a big deal and looked at by all states across the nation. So what does that process involve? It starts with TEKS adoption. The TEKS are revised or the TEKS are newly created. Shelley, of course, will talk to you a little bit more about TEKS in a few minutes. Once we have new TEKS, the board puts out a call for instructional materials. That's the proclamation. We're going to get into more detail about the proclamation in a few minutes. After the proclamation is issued and submissions are made, we review these submissions, and then the state board adopts the materials that they choose to adopt after the review. After the materials are adopted, we create all of the adopted materials in accessible forms. So we take all of your print materials that have been adopted and turn them into Braille materials for our students who need Braille, or large print, or audio for students who need those formats. And then we also, at that same time, put those products into the EMAT system so that they can be easily ordered and distributed. And then finally, the products are implemented in the classroom. The products are implemented in the classroom in the school year for which the proclamation is named. So this is just sort of a rehash of that. The proclamation itself is the call for materials. It's named for the year in which the materials will be implemented. Each proclamation includes subject areas and courses being called for, a schedule of adoption procedures, those are things that Amy will go over in more detail in a few minutes, the requirements that publishers must meet throughout the course of the review and adoption in order to have their materials ready for, eligible for adoption, and instructions for publishers on how to provide electronic files for those special format products that we talked about. Publishers submit products in response to the proclamation. State review panels review them for TEKS and ELPS coverage. They get reviewed by the public, as I said, for anything and everything that the public wants to look for. The state board then holds a public hearing, sometimes it holds two, in order to provide more opportunity for public input. And then the state board makes adoption decisions. We're going to talk about the timeline for this in a few minutes, but the adoption decisions that the board makes are based on TEKS coverage, ELPS coverage, freedom from factual errors, compliance with required manufacturing standards, and also, and this isn't on the slide because it's a slightly different part of the process, whether the board believes that those materials are appropriate for the grade level and subject. All of the materials that are adopted must be fully accessible to students with disabilities. Debbie will talk more about this in a few minutes. They're made accessible through the provision to the agency of electronic files that allow us to provide those accessible versions. They have to be accessible whether they are print products or not. Publishers are responsible for ensuring that electronic products are fully accessible, and again, Debbie will talk a little bit more about that. You have to actually provide us with proof that those products are accessible, and we'll talk about that and how that is done as we get a little more into the details. If districts choose to purchase materials that are not adopted, then the districts themselves are responsible for ensuring that those materials are accessible, including having Braille products actually constructed, which can be very expensive if they have a student who needs those products in Braille. And then finally, they're adopted on a local level. Every district has its own process for selecting instructional materials and whether or not they can select adopted materials or non-adopted materials. The school board has to consider those materials in an open meeting, and the materials that are actually adopted locally must add up to coverage of 100% of the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills for the required curriculum in all courses other than PE. And each year the district must certify to us that they do in fact have those materials that meet all of those requirements. And they have to do that every year prior to being able to order instructional materials for the following year. Districts are in the process of doing that right now. If a district chooses to adopt non-adopted materials, then the district is locally responsible for reviewing the materials to ensure that the TEKS are covered. The district is locally responsible for providing accessible versions. The district orders materials not through EMAT but directly from the publisher, and then they can request disbursement funds to pay for those materials. And that is a general overview, pretty broad, pretty high level of the adoption process in Texas. We'll take a look at some of the questions that I've been seeing go by and take opportunities throughout the course of the webinar, or at least at the very end, and to answer as many of those questions as we can. We'll also publish the answers to those questions, so keep sending them in. We like to watch that question list get longer as we present because it lets us know that you guys are involved and focused on the information that's being shared. Next up, we will have a TEKS and ELPS overview with Shelley Ramos, our Senior Director of Curriculum.
Hi, good morning. This is Shelley Ramos from the Curriculum Standards and Student Support Division. And it's my pleasure this morning to talk to you a little bit about the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, the state curriculum standards, and the English language proficiency standards, and how they are related to Proclamation 2020. So first, I wanted to make sure to give a brief overview of the courses called for in Proclamation 2020 for English Language Arts and Reading. Those are our high school courses, English 1, 2, 3, and 4. And for English as a second language, those are our ESOL courses. We have ESOL 1 and 2, and a new course beginning in 2020, and that's called English Language Development and Acquisition. And the asterisks simply indicate that that is a brand new course for the first time in 2020. I do want to just take a moment to briefly give you an overview of how English 1 and 2 are related to ESOL 1 and 2. So for those of you who may not know, in the state of Texas, an English language learner may substitute ESOL 1 for ESOL 2 and ESOL 2 for English 2. I might have misspoken. So they're just a direct substitution, English 1 for ESOL 1 and English 2 for ESOL 2. As many of you know, last year, the State Board of Education in spring of 2017 finalized what was a 2-year process in the review and revision of our English and Spanish language arts and reading texts. And so what we have are a brand new set of texts for English and Spanish language arts and reading and ESL. And I want to just share with you just an overview of the changes. Some of you may already be familiar with this, if you're familiar with our kindergarten through grade 8 English and Spanish language arts and reading courses. It was a full revision, so you will expect to see a completely new set of standards. In many ways, they have many similarities to the current standards, but in many ways, they'll look entirely different. Overall, we hope that you see that the TEKS themselves have been streamlined. That was one of the directions that the State Board of Education gave to their text review committees, was to reduce the amount of content in the TEKS. There is increased vertical alignment across the grade level, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the resources that can help you see that vertical alignment. And then you'll also see increased horizontal alignment between the English TEKS and the Spanish TEKS with differentiation as appropriate. That's probably not as relevant to Proclamation 2020 because our English 1 and 2 courses and ESOL 1 and 2 courses are virtually identical, with the exception in ESOL 1 and 2 of the addition of student expectations that address student language proficiency. Another major change that you'll see, and this is probably the very first thing that you'll observe upon looking at the new TEKS, is that they have a new organizational structure. The new TEKS are organized around 7 new strands, and I'll go over those in just a moment. And another key feature that you'll notice in the TEKS is actually the lack of a feature that you might have been used to in the current TEKS, and that's Figure 19, which is where reading comprehension was addressed. It's no longer a separate portion of the TEKS. It is now, those standards are now integrated into the general student expectations for each grade level and course. And primarily, you'll see that in 2 strands, in the comprehension strand and the response strand. So speaking of those strands, there are, as I mentioned, 7 new strands that are the organizing structure for the English and ESOL TEKS. You can see the list of those strands here. We've got developing and sustaining foundational language skills, comprehension, response, multiple genres, author's purpose and craft, composition, and inquiry and research. So again, it may look entirely new, but to a large extent, it really is a reorganization of the current strands and a refinement of the language of those standards. A little bit more information for you regarding these strands because they are new and we understand that people are still in the early stages of getting accustomed to them. But all of the strands address the 4 domains of language. So they each address listening, speaking, reading, writing, as well as thinking. And I'll show you an example of what I mean when I say that they're addressed in each of the strands, in each of the knowledge and skill statements. Some strands are made up of what we've been referring to as substrands. So there is a kind of a sub-concept to the particular strand. And those strands do vary by grade level. However, for English 1 through 4 and English as a second language, those substrands are identical for all of the courses. And the substrands, of course, they will have unique knowledge and skill statements, and they're organized around similar topics. And I will show you an example of that in just a moment. So this is an example of one of our strands, and it's a knowledge and skill statement. I did use this particular strand because it is brand new, and some of the concepts and the student expectations under the response skill strand are brand new for the first time in the new TEKS. So you can see here that the strand, response skills, listening, speaking, reading, writing, and thinking using multiple texts, that is the strand. Then the rest of this goes on to identify the knowledge and skill statement, and then it would be followed, of course, by the student expectations. But because this is a significant change from the current TEKS, I did want to spend a moment to make sure that you had an opportunity to see what these new strands look like. I mentioned substrands earlier. So this slide has on it for you an example of some substrands. So in our multiple genres strand, they are divided into two substrands, literary elements and genres. And so you can see here I've highlighted in blue where you can find the substrand when there is one. And now, not every strand has substrands, but there are a couple of strands that do. I think there are a total of 3. And you'll see that they each have their own knowledge and skill statement, and then the student expectations that align with each of those knowledge and skill statements would fall underneath each one. So a little bit more about what's new in our English and Spanish language arts and reading TEKS. So one key factor that we wanted to make sure to point out to you for English 1 through 4 and ESOL is it actually does fall under our multiple genre strand. In the past, genres were identified, or types of literature were identified only for English 3 and English 4, but for the first time with the new 2020 TEKS, you will see that the new TEKS do identify types of literature with which students must be familiar. So English 1 and ESOL 1, students are required to be familiar with American, British, and world literature. And I've added the reference to that particular student expectation if you'd like to go and look at it yourself. It's in 7A across all the courses. At English 2 and ESOL 2, the focus is on world literature. At English 3, the focus remains on American literature, and at English 4, it remains the same, British literature. So I did want to take a moment here to talk to you a little bit about the new course. It's English Language Development and Acquisition, or ELDA, as it's commonly referred to. This is a particular course that is designed for our English learners, and it must be taken concurrently with either ESOL 1 or ESOL 2. So it's what we consider a co-requisite, but I do want to clarify, a student may certainly take ESOL 1 or 2 and not be enrolled in ELDA, but if they are enrolled in ELDA, they must be concurrently enrolled in either ESOL 1 or 2. So the purpose of this particular course is to offer students additional support and content related to developing and mastering English language acquisition skills. The last thing I want to make sure to mention to you about all of our courses is just a plug to be sure that you go and take a look at the introductions that are included in the TEKS. There's oftentimes very helpful information about the philosophy behind the TEKS and particular key points that the State Board wanted to point out, and that information would be included in the introductions for each course or grade level, It is the very first thing you come across when you open up the TEKS for a particular course. We are here at TEA in the process of working on a number of supporting documents and resources to help teachers implement the new standards and become familiar with the new standards prior to implementation. Some of those resources and supporting documents have already gone live on our webpage, and others are coming soon or over the course of the next several months. So I just wanted to walk you through what each of those are. First, we have vertical alignment charts that show how the student expectations progress over every grade level and course. Those documents have been available on the TEA website for a number of months. Coming soon, we'll have side-by-side documents that compare the current TEKS to the new TEKS. We expect to start posting those for kindergarten through grade 8 in the next few weeks, and then our focus will turn to the high school courses, so those will be coming soon. Essentially, you'll be able to see at the level of each student expectation whether it's correlated to one of the current student expectations or whether it is a new student expectation. And in some instances, some of our current SEs are no longer addressed explicitly in the new TEKS. And then lastly, not lastly, but next on the list are breakouts. For those of you who are familiar with the State Instructional Materials Adoption process, our Instructional Materials Division provides breakouts that take each student expectation and then identify the component parts. And the same is also done for our English language proficiency standards. And then the last resource that we will be providing are college and career readiness alignment charts. These are charts that identify how each student expectation is addressed in the college and career readiness standards. And we are in the process of working on those now. We expect them to be available this summer. If you're curious to see what the alignment is to our CCRS, this document will be of particular use to you. I did want to make sure to give you a brief overview of the ELPS, our English Language Proficiency Standards. As you may know, the ELPS provide proficiency level descriptors for our English language learners in the 4 domains: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And they are at the various proficiency levels so that a teacher can gauge the proficiency level and what they should be, what type of instruction they should be providing to students. The ELPS are applicable to every course and grade level. In particular in English, all of the adopted courses do need to be addressed in the ELPS. Materials must only cover those standards that have been designated as appropriate for inclusion in instructional materials, but they do need to address 100% of the standards that are designated for inclusion. And there are fewer standards in the ELPS than there are in the student expectations, and just wanted you to be aware of that. If you're not familiar with the ELPS, I'll include information for you in a slide in just a moment about how you can access the ELPS if you're not familiar with them, and so that you can go in and take a look at those proficiency standards. I do want to make sure to note for you that the ELPS have not yet changed. They will not change for this particular proclamation. They are, however, scheduled to begin review next year. That will not have an impact on the requirements for Proclamation 2020. So if in the coming months you hear mention of the revision of the ELPS, don't worry, that's for a future implementation year and will not impact these particular instructional materials. So lastly, just a little bit of information on where you can find the TEKS and the ELPS and the supporting information that I've mentioned. If you're familiar with our TEA webpage, you know that we have these icons across the top of the page. You want to go to the second icon, which is academics, and then you'll go directly to the link under curriculum standards for the TEKS. The other link that you want to be familiar with is this review and revision link. That is 2 links below that. Once you've gone to the TEKS, then you will have two places to look. One is for the English Language Arts and Reading Standards for English 1 through 4 in Chapter 110. And the other in Chapter 128 is where you can find the English as a Second Language standards for ESOL 1, ESOL 2, and ELSA. Also on this page, you'll be able to access a link to the ELPs. So you can get to all of the documents from this one page, and hopefully it's very clear and easy to find. I do want to take a second to point out to you that currently, because these new TEKS have not yet been implemented in classrooms and won't be until the 2020-2021 school year, we do have a situation where we have two sets of TEKS living side by side in the Texas Administrative Code. We've tried to make the titles as easy to differentiate the two sets of TEKS as possible. So you will be looking for, make sure you are looking for the TEKS that say adopted 2017 in the title, and that you're not accessing the ones that say beginning with school year 2009-2010. Those are the outgoing TEKS. Lastly, for accessing the supporting information documents, you would use the link for text review and revision. That will take you to this web page, and you'll see underneath subject area reviews, you will be able to link to the English Language Arts and Reading text and the Spanish Language Arts and Reading and ESL text. We will also be posting the supporting information documents directly to our English and our Spanish web pages on the TEA website. They'll be listed in both places so that no matter where you go, you'll be able to access those documents.
Thank you, Shelley. We have Kelly Calloway up next, who will be talking about an overview of Proclamation 2020.
Just an overview of the proclamation, this specific proclamation. Someone asked a question in the stream of questions a few minutes ago about the actual timeline for the steps that I talked about in the first presentation, and we're going to go over that timeline right now. First of all, the proclamation calls for materials in these courses. Shelley's already gone over that, so I'll just point out that the slide is here in case you need access to it. The submissions are specified in the proclamation, and they're a little bit different than submission options for previous proclamations. This changed with Proclamation 2019. So if you are not participating in 2019, but have participated in the past, you need to be aware of these new submission options. First of all, you can submit new materials. That's the traditional thing, materials that you develop specifically in response to these new revised TEKS. You can also submit existing materials that are aligned to the revised TEKS. So let's say you've got a program out there that's adopted now. That program is still a high quality program. That program can be realigned simply by creating new correlations, and you determine that that program meets 100% or even 50% of the revised TEKS, then you can submit those programs for review and adoption. You can also take those programs, add to them with supplemental materials that will allow them to meet the required TEKS. So in other words, you've got a program currently adopted, you do an audit of it, you decide it meets maybe 50%, maybe 40%, maybe 80%, and with the addition of some supplemental products, you can bring it into compliance with 100% of the TEKS, or with whatever percentage you're aiming for. You can submit those products as well. In that case, correlations would come from both your existing product and the additional components that you add to that product. So like I said, that's something new and different. It's fairly new. This language was also in Proclamation 2019, but if you participated in 10 or 11 or 14 or 15 but not 19, then this is information that might be new to you. The action by the board will be taken at their April meeting. We presented a draft of the proclamation to them in January, and they discussed it. We're expecting them to actually issue the proclamation at their next meeting. They will discuss it first in the committee of the full board, which is scheduled to occur on Wednesday, April 11th. That's often the part that you really want to be listening to if you want to listen or attend the board, because that's the part where there is sometimes more rigorous discussion about the various options. The actual issuance, though, occurs on Friday, just like all actual action taken by the board that has to occur at the general meeting on Friday. And again, if you're interested in attending or listening, you will want to attend and listen to that day as well. Sometimes it's just a repeat of what we had on Wednesday. Other times there are new and exciting changes. So quick timeline. The board discussed Proclamation 2020 in January, like I said. TEA conducts a meeting in March to discuss and solicit input. This is this meeting. That's what we're doing right now here today. The board will be presented the proclamation and we expect take action on it in April. In June, we will present them with an official document called Questions and Answers, and they will approve that document or ask for revisions to that document. Once that document is approved, it provides very important information for you if you are participating in the proclamation. In August, we will post a publisher handbook that gives you more detail than the proclamation gives you, and again is very important information to you. We will also ask for state review panel nominations and start collecting those nominations and applications. And we will hold another webinar in addition to this one that is more specific and more detailed regarding the actual issued proclamation. In May of 2019, we will provide details to you about the summer state review panel meetings. In June through August, we will conduct those state review panel meetings and report on the findings of those panels. In September, the proclamation will be on the state board agenda again in the form of a public hearing and a discussion where we will provide them information from the summer review panels, and they will hear from the public about the materials under consideration. In October, we provide them final information based on information about errors that you submit to us, and also the actual final results of the summer reviews. And in November, they may have another public hearing, but they definitely will take action regarding those materials that have been submitted. Amy's going to talk in more detail about specific components of Proclamation 2020.
Thank you, Kelly. Yes, as Kelly mentioned, we'll be passing things off to Amy. And I know we've given you a lot of information this afternoon. However, don't worry if you've missed something. We will be posting all of our slides and a recording of the webinar to the publisher portal. So let's go ahead and move forward and pass things off to Amy.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to all of you for spending your time with us this morning to learn more about Proclamation 2020. Proclamation 2020 has several components, and it's very important that you take time to read through and understand each one because they all contain different information. The components include an introduction, a schedule of adoption procedures, there's a section for additional information, accessibility requirements, deliverables and other requirements, student enrollment and standards, TEKS and ELTs, and an appendix. The introduction tells you the subject areas and grade levels or courses for which instructional materials are being called. It describes the minimum adoption standards and tells you what types of materials are being requested. And Kelly went over much of that. The schedule of adoption procedures is a list of significant dates and deadlines for everyone who participates in the review and adoption process. This includes deadlines for the SBOE, for TEA, publishers, state review panel members, the education service centers, members of the public, and school districts. You should read over the schedule of adoption procedures very carefully and make note of all of the relevant due dates. I'm going to go over some of those due dates that will occur soonest, but there's way more than I'm going to cover in this presentation. The first deadline is for the Statement of Intent to Bid, which is due from publishers on Friday, December 7th of this year. A Statement of Intent to Bid is how the publisher indicates a desire to submit instructional materials for review. Publishers will submit the Statement of Intent to Bid using EMAT, so it's not a paper form or a form that you'll download. It's something that you'll go into a system and complete. And we will provide training this fall to demonstrate how you should submit your Statement of Intent to Bid. And it's not necessary to request EMAT access to do this. You're going to submit a separate Statement of Intent to Bid for each product and course for which you intend to submit materials, but you will not submit a separate bid for all the different pricing options and media formats that you intend to offer. Your Statement of Intent to Bid will provide very basic information about your materials, including the program title, the course or grade level, estimated TEKS coverage percentage, media format, and system requirements for those electronic products. Much of what you provide on this form is tentative. You're going to be able to update everything that you enter into the bid except for the course or grade level. If you don't submit a Statement of Intent to Bid for a specific course, you cannot submit materials for that course, and there aren't any exceptions made to this deadline. So it's very, very important that you make note of the Friday, December 7th deadline. Complete descriptions, which are the next deliverable, are due on January 25th of next year. The complete description is going to provide information only about those components that you plan to give to the review panels in order to verify TEKS and ELPS coverage. That includes the program and component titles, the unique ISBNs for the program as a whole and for each component, the number of print pages intended for student use, and the system requirements for all digital components. And I'm sorry, I should have removed preliminary price because you won't be asked to provide that for the program level. You will give it for the component level. Unlike the Statements of Intent to Bid, you're going to submit a complete description for every product and course and for each media format. The next deadline is for preliminary correlations, and those are due on February 22nd of next year. Those preliminary correlations are going to provide examples of how you intend to present the information regarding the specific location in the materials where you believe TEKS and ELPS are covered. And I know that sounds kind of strange, but all we're trying to do is to give you feedback on your work and make sure that you're providing your correlations in the clearest, best way possible. I know a lot of you will want to get a head start on this work, but I want to caution you that we're going to provide you with a correlation template to use. So it's a specific Excel document in which you're going to be giving your citations. So you can do some preliminary work trying to figure out where your materials meet the standards, but in terms of documenting your citations, you're going to do that on a form that we provide to you. And you're only going to need to do this for one product and course. We only need one preliminary correlation document regardless of how many products you're submitting for review. And you don't need to do the whole correlation instrument, just 1 or 2 pages so that we can get a good idea of your strategy. Your pre-adoption samples are due on April 5th of 2019. You must provide one complete electronic pre-adoption sample copy of the instructional materials to TEA and to each of the 20 ESCs. Any new digital program, including online programs, must embed the correlations to the TEKS and the ELPs, which means that a user must be able to click on your correlations and be directed to the exact location where you believe the TEKS or ELPs are covered. This only applies to digital products that aren't currently adopted. All samples that require a login must allow multiple users to be logged in at the same time. And it's important to note that we will be posting the access information to each of the samples on our website for public review until the deadline for post-adoption samples. At the same time, you'll also be required to submit correlations, and these are your final correlations. And you'll provide specific information about the location where you believe the TEKS and the ELPs are covered, and you have to use that template that I mentioned that's provided by TEA. You'll be required to provide a separate correlation document for every product and course, and we will provide those correlations to the reviewers, which they will use as their primary resource for determining TEKS coverage. For that reason, it's very important and imperative to the success of your review that those correlations are carefully chosen and constructed and that they are very, very clear. The next section is additional information, and this section provides guidance and statutory citations regarding the adoption process and the conditions for adoption. The accessibility requirements section outlines what publishers of both print and electronic materials must do to meet the specific requirements that ensure materials are accessible to students with disabilities. Meeting these accessibility requirements is a condition of adoption. Debbie will provide you with lots more information about the accessibility requirements, but I want to emphasize that it's very important that you understand those requirements so that you can develop your products with that in mind rather than trying to bring your completed product into compliance. In the deliverables and other requirements section, you will find a more detailed information about publisher requirements and the deliverables in the schedule of adoption procedures. You'll also find the statutory citations associated with the deliverables and the requirements in this section. You'll notice that the items in this section are organized in the order in which they are due. I suggest revisiting this section along with the schedule of adoption procedures before you submit any deliverable, just to make sure you have a clear understanding of what you're supposed to submit. The student enrollment section currently provides the enrollment numbers based on what was available in PEIMS for the 2016-17 school year. Since the English Language Development and Acquisition course is new, we won't have enrollment information for it. But we will update the information in this section soon with the enrollment numbers for the 2017-18 school year once that information is available. The next section provides you direct links to the TEKS and the ELPs. So I've seen lots of questions about where to access the standards, and I know Shelley covered that and provided you with some pathways to use, but also as a resource, you could always go to the proclamation and click on the TEKS or ELPs directly from it. And remember that your products must cover at least 50% of the TEKS and 100% of the ELPs in order to be eligible for adoption. The appendix is the last section in the proclamation, and in this section you'll find a list of resources for general accessibility, designing accessible websites, and closed captioning and audio description. There's also a glossary in this section that defines many of the terms that we use throughout the proclamation. Each section of the proclamation contains very important information. I strongly encourage you to read and reread each section carefully. Take time to click on the different links that we've included in there for you and explore those resources. And definitely do not hesitate to ask questions when you have them.
Thank you, Amy. A lot of really good, important information. I do want to share that the draft version that was presented to the board at their last meeting of Proclamation 2020 is available on the Proclamation's webpage. So that's very good information as well. So we will go ahead and pass it off to Debbie, who will be talking about accessibility.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for attending. I'm going to talk a little bit about accessible instructional materials. As Amy mentioned, in order to be eligible for adoption, the instructional materials have to be accessible to any student with disabilities. Keeping that in mind, it's usually best practice to think about and design your materials with the accessibility requirements in mind. People with disabilities frequently experience barriers to the use of printed materials, digital materials, and technologies. So examples might be textbooks, digital documents, websites, electronic devices, and ideally, those things will be designed from the start for a wide range of users with diverse abilities and disabilities. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. So accessibility is really the practice of making those instructional materials usable. And I really like the word usable because if it's accessible, then it's going to be usable by everyone. And it's treating everyone the same. It's treating all the kids in your classroom or in a classroom the same, where they have access to the same materials that everyone else has. And it gives everybody the same opportunities, no matter what their ability or circumstances. Accessible instructional materials are designed or enhanced in a way that makes them usable again across the widest range of learning variability, regardless of the format. We talk about accessibility for two different types of materials. First, print materials, which is probably what most people think of when they think about accessibility. So some students are going to need specialized formats for print materials. We do contract with vendors to make textbooks available in Braille, large print, audio, or digital text. In fact, we are required to do that by the Individuals with Disabilities Act, IDEA. So publishers of those print materials will be required to provide TEA and the designated third party, either for Braille, large print, audio, digital text, with what we call NIMAS files. The NIMAS files are files that are the technical standard used to produce the file from which the accessible student-ready alternate format version of the materials can be created and distributed to students with print disabilities. And the publishers are required to provide us with those NIMAS files for the print materials. Then we talk about electronic materials, which is kind of a new thing. Electronic instructional materials have to comply with the Federal Rehabilitation Act, Section 508, or we call it 508, and also any web content has to comply with Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or what we call WCAG 2.0 level AA. Those materials would include CD-ROMs, DVDs, particularly web-based materials, ebooks, and one of the most important things is that publishers will be required to contract with an independent third party to provide a report to TEA that will verify that each electronic component complies with these appropriate accessible standards. So, keeping in mind that when something is digital, it's not necessarily accessible. Born digital is a little bit different than born accessible. Materials created from the start to presented on a digital platform are considered born digital. That's kind of digital as opposed to analog, which would be a print book or a film. Digital does not always mean accessible. One of the, a good example that I always think about is how many times do we use a mouse? We use the mouse all the time. For some people with disabilities, that's not a possibility. They have to be able to use something from the keyboard. So that would be an example of something born digital, but not necessarily accessible. So as technologies have changed, it's become really possible to access a variety of content in a large range of formats. With the changes has come a new imperative to create content that is not only born digital, but also born accessible. It's much easier to create something from the beginning that is accessible than it is to go back and try and retrofit something. So you need to consider ways to make digital content accessible to all and shift to born accessible thinking. Probably one of the best resources is what we call the AIM site, which is Accessible Educational Materials, www.aem.cas.org. They do have a special part of their website that addresses just publishers and software developers. And finally, these are the things that you probably need to familiarize yourself with when it comes to accessibility. Proclamation 2020. In the proclamation on these pages and in the appendix, there's some really good resources. IDEA is another resource, Section 508 and WCAG 2.0. And I will say that Section 508 had a refresh last year, so it now does include WCAG 2.0 in Section 508. So it's sometimes we got questions about, well, do I do Section 508 or do I do WCAG 2.0? And the answer is you do both. And that is reflected in that refresh for Section 508.
Thank you, Debbie. We're going to go ahead and pass things off to Amy. She'll be talking about next steps in the process. So for those of you who are still interested in Proclamation 2020 and are considering submitting materials, I have some specific steps that I recommend you take. First, reviewing all of the important information and documents. So that would include the Texas Education Code, Chapter 31, Chapter 66 of the Texas Administrative Code, and the proclamation itself. There's lots of information to explore on the TEA website, and in a moment I'm going to take you on a little test drive of that. You should also sign up for the Review and Adoption Listserv, which will ensure that you get all of the email communications about the proclamation. And then, as Kelly mentioned, to watch the live or archived SBOE meetings in April and again in June, because we know for sure we'll have Proclamation 2020 on the agenda in April, and if it's issued, we'll have it on the agenda for the questions and answers in June. Finally, you should mark your calendar for December 7th of this year. That's when you have to submit your statement of intent to bid. And if you miss that deadline, you're not allowed to participate in Proclamation 2020. So it's super important. And I'm going to take a moment to share my screen. And starting here at the TEA homepage, I just want to show you how you would get to the instructional materials page and also to the publisher portal. So if you hover over the academics tile here in the first column, you'll see instructional materials. So you can click this to get to the main instructional materials page, or you can skip right to a specific page if you're interested in a particular
topic, but I'm going to start with the instructional materials page. From here, if you scroll down to to general information, you can see join our listserv. So that's where you would join that review and adoption listserv that I mentioned. On the right-hand side, you'll see those same options that were listed under the tile, and I want to point out that the publisher portal is where this webinar recording will be posted, and you'll see a new section for Proclamation 2020 here at the top, and we will post the webinars just like you see we've posted those for Proclamation 2019 down here. So definitely visit and bookmark those pages. And then if you're interested in viewing the State Board of Education meeting, if you hover over About TEA, and down here under Leadership, you can find a link to the State Board of Education. And when it's time, you'll be able to click Live and Archive Broadcast, and from there you will be able to view the live recording if it's in progress or the archived version if the time has already passed. So, I'm going to get back to my slideshow and actually
Amy?
pass it over to Kelly.
Amy?
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I'm going to ask you to go back to the website for just a minute, please, and show them where they can read the draft of Proclamation 2020 and also the new language that we added to that page on Monday regarding the machine-readable TEKS.
Okay. So if you hover over the academics tile and select Proclamations under Instructional Materials, we can see the Proclamation 2020 header. There's a link here to the draft version of the proclamation, and right below that, this is what Kelly is mentioning. It says that at this most recent meeting, the SBOE requested that the TEA machine-readable TEKS be added to the proclamation. So that is a requirement for publishers to use the machine-readable TEKS in those digital products. And now, I will turn it over to Kelly.
Thank you. I'll just say one or two words about the machine-readable TEKS. We don't have any hard information about those just yet. We are expecting in the next few weeks, though, to be able to publish a link to the site through which you can access those machine-readable TEKS. If you ask us questions about them now, we're just going to have to say we'll let you know when we know. But we expect more information to be available very, very shortly. That was just a question I anticipated. I'm just scrolling through the questions that you've submitted through the course of the webinar, and I think we have maybe successfully answered most of them. Those questions will be available to you in writing along with their answers over the course of this week sometime, as will this entire presentation. I do see one question that we haven't answered that we can, and that is, are any sample correlations available? We do not have any sample correlations yet. These products are, of course, at various stages of construction at this point, and so no correlations would be available yet. There are some other questions that we haven't quite answered, but I think we've answered all of those that we can. I just scrolled back through, and I believe we've answered all the questions that we can answer right here, right now. So I'm simply going to say thank you very, very much for attending. Please send us in additional questions. Maybe you're not a multitasker and you just jotted down your questions, or you think of them later this afternoon or tomorrow. Please send them to us, and we will be glad to add them to the list of questions. If you just want to visit about something that you heard here today, we are more than happy to take your calls as well. And so now I just want to thank TEA staff, Sarah for hosting the meeting, Tammy for running the meeting, Shelley for participating from curriculum, Amy and her team for putting the meeting agenda together and providing their presentations, and thank you for me. We really all appreciate your participation. Have a great afternoon.